Our first dark adventure takes us to the Cavern of Dreams. This is a nice flexible project that allows us to explore colour and to plan out our scene intuitively, so don't be worried about yours looking exactly the same as mine. For colours, I have Prussian blue, primary yellow, phthalo green and white, plus a little cobalt turquoise light. The cobalt is a lovely bright turquoise by itself that also makes a really nice bright green when mixed with primary yellow. And these saturated colours are what's going to provide the sense of illumination in this scene. Now, our background is going to be a loose blend of these colours in different combinations. And this method of creating an interesting background is one of my favourites. We don't need it to be perfectly smooth, and we can be flexible with the placement of the different colours. To show the sense of light, we need to create contrast. So we want to balance those bright areas with plenty of darker shadows. And I'm going to begin with my 1/2 inch angled shader and the turquoise and primary yellow to get those bright spots established first. These colours will always have the most impact when painted onto the bare white page. And I'm just painting the colours on in rough overlapping strokes. No precision or tidiness needed here. Around these we can begin to add the darker mixtures, the Prussian blue and phthalo green in whatever pleasing combinations we like. And I like to just plonk all these colours onto the page when I'm applying them. I'm not worried about blending and smoothness, that comes next. So when your page is covered, we can switch to blending mode. For this, you'll want to clean your brush well. Blending is best done with a clean and paper towel dried brush. The small amount of moisture left in the bristles helps to reactivate the paint on the page, just enough to soften the colours together with gentle back and forth strokes. Work on a small area at a time for this step, being sure to clean and re-blot your brush as needed. A dirty brush will slowly make all of your colours a bit muted and muddy, and we really want to keep them as clear and bright as possible. Don't worry about perfect smoothness though, we have lots of detail to add over the top for this scene, leaving only bits of the background peeping through, so smooth-ish is good enough. Once the background is blended, let it dry fully before continuing. So our next step is to establish the placement of the waterfalls, and we'll do this with our angled shader again, well dried on a paper towel, and then a little white gouache straight from the tube. We want a dry brush and a dry paint mixture so we can add our waterfalls in nice textured strokes. I like to separate some white from the pile and brush it out onto the palette in a thin layer. This makes it easier to load a small even amount along the end of the bristles. You can test this technique out on a piece of cardboard or coloured scrap paper first to check if you have the correct consistency. You're looking for this broken, dry brush texture, and you'll use your brush to create a vertical stripe down the page, starting at the top of the waterfall each time and dragging down. Now your waterfalls can go wherever you like, but if you take a look at what I've done here, I've added the falls so they pass over the top of the darker areas. And this does a couple of things. It means I'm getting some nice contrast with the white over the darker colours, but I'm also leaving the brighter areas to become the illuminated caverns. So take a look at your background and see where you think the waterfalls would look best. All the waterfalls need some pools to emerge from, and we'll do this again with some white, this time working horizontally in smooth side-to-side strokes. And this doesn't need to be textured. We can have a little extra touch of water on the brush to create a smoother path of white that's able to mix a little with the colours underneath. We're left with a lighter area that looks like a luminous pool. For the waterfalls, we can take our round brush to thicken the top of the white area. Again, just a fairly dry mixture, but with that little extra control that we get from a smaller brush to really boost the brightness at the top and maybe make some brighter streaks of water falling down. The little bit of unevenness helps to make the water more natural looking. And we can even use this to add a few mini waterfalls off to the sides. So I have 3 falls and 2 pools, but I think I want to add another little waterfall leading to another pool here in the lower left. I already have this middle pool established, so that's what I'll come off for these smaller falls. And here I'm back to the wide angled shader, and something short but wider will work here. Again, always starting each stroke from the top of the waterfall edge. Underneath this, we can use horizontal strokes to mark in the suggestion of another pool here. And I like this composition much better. The trio of pools, the different size falls, and their spread across the page feels much more natural. So we have our waterfalls and pools in place. Now we need to bring the structure of the cavern to them, enclosing them in rock and creating the edges that the water tumbles over. And for this we'll use a dark mixture of phthalo green and Prussian blue. Or if you use different colours for your background, you just want to use whatever combination of colours created your darker areas. I've grabbed my size 4 round brush here so that I can have full control over the shapes that I add. And we'll start by creating these little platforms underneath the pools and behind the waterfalls. I'm roughly using the darker areas of the background to inspire the shape and the placement of these rocks, but I also don't mind painting over lighter areas to make it look how I want. I'm also going to enclose the top of the cavern and create a sharper edge up here. This will give us somewhere to add moss and a few hanging plants and vines. Same for the lower pools, use your shadow colour to create the platforms under the water's edge. Now, if you don't want to create the shape of the rock underneath or decide where it ends, then you don't need to. You can just blend your dark colour out into the background with a clean damp brush. And that's what I've done around this lower pool. I always like to have this mixture of harder details and other softer implied details. Along the back edges of our pools, let's add some bushes, and for this I'm using a dark teal colour. This is phthalo green with a little Prussian blue, a touch of yellow and white for a dark but cloudy colour. Use your round brush to add your bushes. These can have flat bottoms along the water's edge and then interesting lumpy tops. I added these along the back of both of the more open pools and not worrying about the smaller stepped pool. For the small pool, I used the dark mixture of phthalo green and Prussian blue to create the shadowy rock structure underneath, blending it out into the background colour at the bottom. At this stage, our big structure work is done and we can switch to adding smaller details and those little touches of magic. So we have this lovely dark edge along the top, and like I mentioned, we'll add some silhouettes to this to make it more interesting. I've grabbed my liner brush and the dark blue-green mixture, and you can add some little looping vines, some lumpy hanging plants, whatever you like across this edge. We'll also use the same colour to add similar details along the edges of the pools to enclose them. And for these, I've added more little plant shapes, but nothing with loads of detail, just clusters of simple silhouettes. On the underside of the rocky edges, we can add more hanging plants and vines. And I like to take my time with these and make sure that I'm adding plants of different shapes and sizes, hanging down at different lengths, generally just creating a pleasing arrangement. and we can continue these along all of the darker edges in our caves. I painted around the rim of the pools, between the waterfalls, and at the right side of the page, just to make the shadows here more interesting. Overall, it gives us this lovely impression of lushness, and all with one small liner brush and one dark colour. And this really is the magic of silhouettes. With our pools somewhat contained, we can go back to the titanium white and pick a few areas for the water to escape in small rivulets. These can be at the edges of the waterfalls or in other areas, once again starting at the top of the fall and dragging straight down. I like to add these in small groups of 2 or 3, and I've sprinkled them about in the darker patches of the scene for the best contrast. I'm pretty sure that a lovely damp cave like this would be full of moss around the walls, so let's add a hint of green texture. We'll do this with a bright green made from phthalo green and primary yellow, and using a dry mixture so no water added. I like my filbert brush best for this technique, and I'll load the tip of the brush with the dry paint before scrubbing it roughly onto the page in small circular shapes. You'll find the dry paint mixture is sticky and super unwilling to part from the brush, and this is why we scrub this texture on. You can see that I point the tip of the brush in towards the center of the page as I'm doing this, so the brightest marks are facing towards the lighter areas of the cave. And then as the paint runs out on the brush, I'll scrub outwards into the shadows a little. You can add a generous helping of this moss all around the dark areas, creating these soft, tufty patches of green emerging from the shadows. Into these little green patches, let's add a sprinkle of smaller mossy details. I've switched to the liner brush and added a little white to this bright green mixture. You can pick a few spots to add some lighter grasses or small clusters of blobs that suggest leafy plants, placing these wherever you like amongst the green. I've also used this light green with the filbert brush to highlight the clumps of moss at the bottom of the page, scrubbing the colour at the top of the green area to give it a hint of soft form. Like we did further up, we can pop a few little planty details across this lighter green. Tiny leaves and blades of grass, anything to create an area of interest against that beautiful dark background here. When you've added your lighter plants, you can take a little time to pick out the rock shape behind the waterfall. A light blue will do for this, and where the water looks a little thinner in spots, you can just swipe up from the bottom dark edge to enhance that structure behind. A round or a liner brush will give you the most control for this. I've tucked a small amount of glowing light under the rock shelf on the right, with just a little white, and applied brightest along the contour of the rock, and then blended out with a clean damp brush to create a subtle glow. In this bottom corner, I have this large dark space. I've kind of created some silhouettes, but nothing is very high contrast because the shadow colour and the background colour here are nearly the same value. I want to make it more interesting, so I'm going to create a hint of a glow emerging from here too. I have my white gouache on the tip of my liner, and I'm popping it into the rough shape of the silhouette here, making it brightest in the smallest, tighter spaces, and then blending it out into the larger area of the background with a clean damp brush. I'll let this dry for a second and then go over the top with the dark colour to pick out a few plant shapes. This is a really nice, easy way to make a bit of boring background just a little different. Lastly, let us create a trail of stars through the darkest areas of the cave. And this is just white gouache on the tip of a round brush. I've arranged my stars in a loose line, making some smaller and a few larger ones until I was happy. A liner brush lets us add a light flare extending up, down, to the left and right across a few of the brightest stars. And this again is just with a little white gouache. Once your stars have fully dried, you can add a little halo of light if you wish. I use the cobalt turquoise and a small amount on a dry brush to scrub a little glow onto those stars with the flares. And to finish up, I added the white star dot back in the centre, along with another pass over the lines to make them pop. And to finish off our dark and mysterious Cavern of Dreams.